It's just past midnight. You're driving alone on a lonely stretch of road. No cars, no houses, just black trees, shadows, the occasional flicker of a street light that probably hasn't worked since the 50s. Up ahead, you see something. A figure on the side of the road. Not walking, not waving, just watching, smiling. You slow down, unsure really why. Your gut is screaming to keep going, but your foot's already on the brake. And then you realize he isn't just smiling, he's communicating. Not with his mouth, but in your head. Thoughts that aren't yours. Words that don't belong. And a name that echoes where no voice should be. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13, your weekly podcast with me, your host Matt, where every week we dive deep into the most fascinating, unexplained phenomena of our time. Today, we're traveling back to November 2nd, 1966, to a lonely stretch of Interstate 77 in West Virginia, where a traveling salesman's life changed forever. But this isn't just another UFO story. This is the tale of an alleged contact with a being, so extraordinary that it would cost this man everything he held dear, yet so compelling that original copies of his book traded for thousands of dollars before being reissued. And it's a story that would somehow become inextricably linked with one of America's most famous cryptids. This is the story of Woody Derenberger and Indrid Cold. Woodrow Derenberger was a middle-aged, ordinary guy from Mineral Wells near Parkersburg, West Virginia. Picture him, if you will. He's a sewing machine salesman in 1966 America. He's driving his red panel truck along the interstate, probably thinking about, that day's sales calls, maybe what his wife was making for dinner. He was the epitome of the American everyman, hardworking, honest, and with a family to support and bills to pay. And on that cold November evening, just before 7:30 p.m., Derenberger was making his familiar drive home from Marietta, Ohio. And the year 1966 was a time of great change in America. The Vietnam War was escalating, the counterculture movement was gaining momentum, and the space race had captured the nation's imagination. But for Woody Derenberger, life was simpler. He sold sewing machines, supported his family, and lived quietly in small-town West Virginia. Then he heard something odd, thinking maybe it was like a sewing machine falling in the back of his truck. He pulled over to check what was making the sound, and that's when his ordinary life became anything but ordinary. He was driving his red panel truck on Route 77 in Parkersburg, West Virginia, when he claimed that he saw a flying metallic cigar-shaped craft. The ship traveled right by his truck, but this wasn't a distant sighting. The craft actually landed, blocking the road ahead of him like a roadblock. And Derenberger described it as resembling an old kerosene lamp globe, flat on the bottom with a dome-like top. He said it was about 35 to 40 feet long, made of a dark gray metal. And the craft hovered silently just 8 to 10 inches above the ground, making only a soft, fluttering noise, kind of like fabric in the wind. And then came the moment that would haunt and define the rest of Derenberger's life. A door opened, and here's a detail that's both mundane and pretty extraordinary. It sounded exactly like a car door. Not some alien hiss, psh, or a mechanical whir or something like that, but just the familiar thunk of a car door opening. And out stepped a man. And remember, this was 1966. Science fiction had kind of conditioned people to expect little green men or these bug-eyed monsters. But what Derenberger saw defied all those expectations completely. The being was about 6 feet tall, appeared to be in his mid to late 30s, with an olive complexion and dark brown hair slicked back. He said he wore a glossy dark blue coat that kind of seemed to shimmer in the light. And most importantly, and this detail becomes crucial to kind of understanding how this legend evolves, Derenberger consistently said that the man's face looked very normal. But the communication wasn't through speech, it was telepathic. So imagine for that moment, you're sitting in your truck, probably gripping the steering wheel, and suddenly there's a voice in your head that isn't your own. And Woody goes on to explain how this first conversation unfolded and what is being said to him in that moment. And just standing there next to his truck, just looking at Woody, Indrid Cold telepathically says, "Be not frightened." And think about those words a little bit. Not don't be scared or calm down, but be not frightened. It's very formal in its phrasing, very polite. Cold then says to him, "Have no fear. We come from a country that is not nearly as powerful as yours. We mean you no harm. We wish you only happiness. We eat, we breathe, we sleep, we bleed even as you do." And notice the reassurance, the emphasis on similarity between them rather than difference. This wasn't the typical alien invasion kind of Hollywood narrative that you hear. This was a being trying to reassure Woody not to be afraid that they are very similar people. Cold tells him, "My name is Cold, and I am a searcher." A searcher, not a conqueror, not a scientist studying specimens, but a searcher. What exactly he was searching for? Well, that's a question that Derenberger spent the rest of his life trying to figure out. Cold asked for Woody's name, and when he saw the glowing lights of Parkersburg out in the distance, he asked what they were. So Woody explained that, it's a city with many people. And Cold thought about this for a second and said that where he came from, they called them gatherings. The conversation lasted only about 5 to 10 minutes, not hours, not some long epic exchange, but just a brief encounter. And before leaving, Cold made 2 more promises that would prove pretty prophetic. He said, "We will see you again." And he advised Derenberger to actually contact the local authorities and tell people about this encounter. And here's where the story gets really interesting, is that it's a detail that often gets overlooked in retellings of the Indrid Cold story. After Woodrow Derenberger's story, a handful of other eyewitnesses did come forward to share their sightings on that same night. A mother with her son Frank and daughter Susan stopped their car and watched the ship shortly after Derenberger's encounter. They didn't know about Woody's experience yet. They were independent witnesses to the same event. So in an age before cell phones and instant communication, multiple people were witnessing the same impossible thing. And over the course of the month that followed, Derenberger claimed that he was visited by Indrid Cold many times, and that he even took him on his spaceship to his home planet. And then Cold would also appear at Woody's front door. His wife and children even knew who this was and was paying him visits. Now, imagine being Woodrow Derenberger's wife. Your husband comes home with this incredible story, and then if what he's telling you is the truth, this mysterious visitor starts showing up at your front door, and your children start talking about the strange man who visits their dad. This wasn't just Woody's story anymore, it was his family's reality. And unlike most people who claim to have these extraordinary encounters, Woody didn't keep quiet. He went straight home, told his wife, then called the Parkland police and contacted the press. Within 24 hours, his story had ignited this media frenzy that culminated in a 30-minute television interview on WTAP. Think about kind of the courage it would take someone to do that. In 1966, America was a deeply conservative place, very suspicious of anything that kind of challenged their conventional reality. Yet here was this ordinary salesman putting his reputation, his livelihood, and his family's peace of mind on the line for what he believed was the truth. And I'm going to play you a part of this interview right now so you can hear Woody's firsthand account of this experience he had with Cold and what he actually told the news reporters the day after the event.
He stopped. As soon as I had stopped, there was a door opened in the side of this vehicle, and this man stepped out and came directly to me, or came to the truck. He walked to the right-hand side of the truck, and he told me to roll down the window. He asked me to roll down the window on my right-hand side of my truck. And I had done what he asked. And this man stood there, and he first asked me what I was called. And I knew he meant my name, and I told him my name. And he asked me, he said, "Why are you frightened?" He said, "Don't be frightened. We wish you no harm." He said, "We mean you no harm. We wish you only happiness." And I told him my name, and when I told him the name, he said he was called Cold. That was the name that he was called by. And he asked me what the city of Parkersburg, he pointed to the lights. He didn't point, but he gave the impression that he was pointing, and he asked me what that was called. And I told him it was Parkersburg. It was a city, a town. And he asked me if most all the people lived in this city or town. And I explained to him that it was a place of business. It's where we transacted our business, that the people lived in communities, outlying communities, most of the people. And when I told him that this was a city, he said that where his home was, that was called a gathering. And again, he told me not to be frightened, which I was. I was very frightened. And as far as I can understand, this was all mental. There was no spoken words from him. I knew what he was asking me, but yet he stood there and his mouth did not move. He had a smile on his face. He appeared very courteous and friendly. And after I talked with him a while, he told me he would see me. He said, "We will see you again." And he left in his vehicle.
Mr. Derenberger, for the sake of our television audience here.
So that was part of Woody's TV interview that he did the day after meeting Cold on that roadway. So everything's still very fresh in his mind, still very detailed in his descriptions and what happened. But that television interview kind of became the beginning of what would become this relentless media siege at his house. The Derenberger home became a ground zero for curiosity seekers, reporters, and investigators. Cars would pull up at all hours of the day and night. Strangers would knock on the door, demanding to hear the story firsthand from Woody. And the family's phone rang constantly, sometimes with genuine inquiries, sometimes with threats and ridicule. And Woody's wife, Connie, found herself just kind of thrust into an impossible situation. Reporters would corner her when she went to the grocery store asking questions about her husband's mental state. Do you believe him? Has he always been this way? The implication was very clear. Either her husband was crazy or she was complicit in this big elaborate hoax. And the children faced their own nightmare too. At school, classmates would taunt them with alien jokes and UFO sound effects. Teachers would look at them with just this mixture of pity and suspicion. Simple activities like just going to the store or attending church became exercises in just enduring stares and whispers. The family that kind of once enjoyed this quiet anonymity was now the most famous, or potentially infamous, depending on how you look at it, household in West Virginia. And the media attention wasn't just local. National publications picked up the story, and suddenly the Derenberger name was being discussed in living rooms just across America. But this fame, as the Derenbergers quickly learned, was a double-edged sword. With every interview, every article, the story grew and changed. Details were embellished, timelines got confused, and their motivations were questioned. An initial investigation did conclude that Derenberger was not a fraud or a hoaxer, and he was mentally and psychologically sound. Professional investigators trained to spot deception and delusion found him credible. But credible or not, going public destroyed his life as he knew it. The cost of this story was devastating for Woody's life. He lost his job, and imagine you're a traveling salesman in 1966, and everyone knows you as the UFO guy. So his employer understandably was concerned about the company's reputation, and they let him go. Their thought was, who would want to buy sewing machines from a man who claimed to have conversations with aliens? His family faced ridicule not just from skeptics, but even from the UFO community, who dismissed his claims as just too outlandish. The pressure that they were under was just relentless. Connie, who had married this quiet, dependable salesman, just suddenly found herself married to West Virginia's most famous contactee. The woman who had once looked forward to her husband's return from his sales routes now dreaded the sound of his truck in the driveway, not because she didn't love him, but because she never knew what new impossible story he would come home with. And the children had perhaps the heaviest burden of the family. In 1966, being different was dangerous, especially in small-town America. Woody's daughter would later recall just kind of the isolation she felt. Her former friends' parents would suddenly find reasons as to why their kids couldn't play with the Derenberger kids anymore. Birthday invitations stopped coming. School events became kind of these exercises in just endurance. But what makes this family's experience a little more extraordinary, at least according to Woody, is that they weren't just hearing about these encounters secondhand. Cold allegedly visited the Derenberger home multiple times, sometimes just appearing at the front door like any other visitor. I mean, imagine sitting at the dinner table when a knock comes at the door and your father gets up and says, "Oh, it's probably Cold." The children claim to have seen him themselves. They described him exactly as their father did. Normal looking, well dressed, speaking in that peculiar kind of formal way. But think about what this kind of meant for a family that was already under this scrutiny. If the visits were real, they were living with the constant knowledge that their father was in contact with something beyond normal human experience. If they weren't real, they were watching their father descend into this elaborate delusion and being expected to participate in it. And Connie was in one of the most difficult positions of all. In interviews, she maintained this careful neutrality, neither confirming or denying her husband's claims, but privately, that strain was enormous. Friends would cross the street to avoid her. At church, whispered conversations would stop when she entered the room. The woman who had once been a respected member of her community was now viewed with suspicion and pity. And the family's finances crumbled along with their social standing. Without Woody's steady income from the sewing machine sales, they struggled to pay their bills, and the constant media attention made it nearly impossible for him to find a new job. Who would want to hire the UFO man? The family that once enjoyed this middle-class stability was pushed to the brink of poverty. But shifting away from the family's specific experiences and struggles, just 2 days after that first encounter, something extraordinary began. Derenberger started receiving regular telepathic communications from Cold while driving. So try to imagine that a little bit. You're making your sales calls, trying to rebuild this shattered career that you had, and every day you're having conversations in your mind with someone claiming to be from another world. And they weren't brief exchanges. According to Derenberger, Cold would provide running commentary on the landscape, ask questions about human customs, and share observations about Earth culture. So Woody's driving through the hills of West Virginia, responding out loud to telepathic questions, looking like to any observer that he's just a man talking to himself, which is, of course, what the skeptics really believed he was doing. And throughout these daily telepathic exchanges, Cold shared more about himself and his origins. He said he came from the galaxy of Ganymede, specifically from a planet called Lanulos in the Ganymede star cluster. The inhabitants of Lanulos, Cold claimed, typically lived 125 to 175 Earth years. But these mental conversations were just kind of the prelude to this whole story. In 1967, Cold allegedly took Derenberger for his first ride in his spaceship. And by 1969, Derenberger claimed that he had personally flown to Cold's home planet not once, but twice. And these weren't brief abduction scenarios, they were extended visits to another world. And before we venture off to Ganymede and Lanulos, let's talk about the alleged earthbound journeys that Derenberger claimed to have taken with Cold as well. These earthbound trips were perhaps more intriguing than the interplanetary ones because they involved locations that could theoretically be verified. According to Derenberger, Cold was fascinated by Earth's diversity and wanted to explore various regions of the planet. Their first journey together took them to the oil fields of Iraq. It's 1967, it's the height of the Cold War, and you have an American salesman who claims to have been taken by an extraterrestrial to the Middle East. Derenberger described the flight as eerily silent while traveling in Cold's craft at these just impossible speeds. He claimed they could cross continents in what felt like minutes, and the craft, he said, moved with no sense of acceleration or turbulence. They would simply be in West Virginia one moment and then hovering over the desert the next. In Iraq, Cold showed particular interest in the oil extraction operations, and he asked Derenberger to explain the process, the purpose, the economic implications. And according to Woody's account, Cold seemed genuinely confused and puzzled by the concept of nations fighting over resources that, from his perspective, seemed relatively simple to obtain or synthesize. And the most detailed of these earthbound journeys was their trip to Afghanistan. This was years before Afghanistan became a household name in American, culture and foreign policy. But Derenberger claimed Cold was particularly interested in this region. They visited rural villages, observing their kind of daily life from a discreet distance. Derenberger described watching Afghan farmers tending their fields, completely unaware that they were being observed by two beings from different worlds. Cold, according to Woody, was fascinated by human agricultural techniques and the way communities would organize themselves around seasonal rhythms. And what makes these accounts particularly intriguing is that Derenberger provided specific details about the geography and the people and the culture of these regions, which are details that for a West Virginia sewing machine salesman in 1967 would have been difficult to obtain without extensive research or actual travel. And during their flight over the Sahara Desert, Cold allegedly explained the history of the region, describing ancient civilizations that had thrived there when it was a lush, green landscape. He spoke of cycles of climate change that spanned millennia and human migrations driven by environmental shifts. These journeys around Earth kind of served as like a graduate course in human civilization. Cold was the eternal student, and Woody was the unwitting guide to the complexities of human culture, economics, and survival. But now let's venture beyond the Earth into the journeys that captured the public imagination the most powerfully. Derenberger's alleged visits to Lanulos, Cold's home planet in the Ganymede star cluster. The first trip, according to Derenberger, occurred in late 1967. The journey itself was as remarkable as the destination. Cold's craft, which Derenberger described as capable of interdimensional travel, didn't simply fly through space in the conventional sense. Instead, it seemed to fold the space and time, allowing them to traverse these impossible distances almost instantaneously. He described the sensation of this travel as unlike anything really imaginable. He claimed there was a moment of complete disorientation, not physical, but perceptual. Kind of like if reality itself briefly kind of dissolved and then reformed around them. One moment they were above the hills of West Virginia, and the next they were approaching a planet that defied everything he thought he knew about worlds beyond Earth. Lanulos, as Derenberger described it, was a paradise that would make Eden look like crap. The planet was larger than Earth, but with lighter gravity, which allowed for these fantastic floating cities and impossible architecture. The landscape was just this kind of tapestry of vibrant colors with forests of trees that had leaves that shifted through the spectrum, oceans that sparkled with this kind of bioluminescent life, and mountains that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the sky. But the inhabitants were kind of the most remarkable feature of all. Derenberger described them as perfect humans, tall, graceful, with an otherworldly beauty that went beyond mere physical appearance. They radiated this kind of sense of peace and contentment that was almost palpable. Men and women moved through their daily lives with this fluid grace. They wore no clothing because they had no concept of shame or social inhibition. The society encountered was post-scarcity in the truest sense of the word. The Lanulans had mastered technology to such an extent that material needs were essentially non-existent. Food was grown in these vast hydroponic gardens that required minimal maintenance. Transportation was provided by moving sidewalks, but also by individual flying devices that seemed to respond to thought rather than physical control. But perhaps kind of most remarkably is that, according to Derenberger, the Lanulans had eliminated conflict entirely. Not through force or through coercion, but what he described as an evolutionary leap in consciousness. They had developed the ability to truly understand each other's perspectives, making deception and selfishness literally impossible. During his first visit there, Derenberger claimed to have stayed for what felt like several days, though he returned to Earth to find that only hours had passed. He was given a tour of their cities, which he described as organic structures that seemed to grow rather than being built. And the buildings spiraled upward like these crystalline trees with walls that were transparent from the inside but opaque from the outside, kind of like a one-way mirror kind of deal. And the Lanulans technology was so advanced that it appeared magical to Woody. They had eliminated disease, aging to a point, and even death from anything other than what they called completion, a voluntary transition when an individual felt their current existence was fulfilled. It reminds me of this quote from writer Arthur Clarke that says, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Now, Derenberger's second journey to Lanulos, which he claimed occurred in 1969, provided even more extraordinary details about this alleged civilization. This time, he was introduced to what he called the Council of Worlds, which is a galactic federation that governed multiple inhabited planets. According to his account, Earth was known to this federation but was considered a developing world, not quite ready for open contact due to humanity's propensity for violence and environmental destruction. The Lanulans, along with inhabitants of several other worlds, served as observers and occasional interveners when human actions threatened to disrupt the broader galactic community. During the second visit, Derenberger claimed to have learned the true history of human Lanulan connections. According to Cold and other Lanulans, Earth had been visited periodically for thousands of years, and many of the events recorded in human religious and mythological texts were, in fact, contacts with various extraterrestrial civilizations, which is, the ancient astronaut theory. But here's the most startling claim, is that Derenberger was told that Lanulos itself had been colonized by humans from Earth thousands of years ago. A group of early humans facing some unspecified catastrophe had been relocated to Lanulos, where they evolved into this peaceful, advanced society he was now witnessing. This revelation kind of reframed everything. If true, Cold wasn't an alien visiting Earth. He was a distant cousin returning to check on the family that stayed behind. The Lanulans weren't studying humanity out of scientific curiosity. They were watching over their genetic relatives with the concern of these elder siblings. Derenberger claimed to have been shown historical records, but he could never really adequately describe how that information was presented to him. But these records, he said, depicted Earth's past in startling detail. He saw, or believed he saw, evidence of advanced civilizations that had risen and fallen long before recorded history began. Which again is another topic that is something that a lot of people think happened on this planet. They believe that we are not the first form of advanced human civilization on the planet, that millennia ago there was other humans that somehow got wiped out and then started over again multiple times. And this is just where we're at now in this iteration of human life. And the Council of Worlds maintained strict policies about intervention in developing worlds. They could observe, they could make limited contact with select individuals, but they could not openly reveal themselves until a species had evolved beyond the threat of self-destruction, which we clearly have not. But Derenberger's cosmic tourism, per se, didn't end with Lanulos. He also claimed to have visited Venus and Saturn, and these accounts present some of the most scientifically problematic aspects of the story. Venus, according to Derenberger, was nothing like the hellish, superheated world that our probes were revealing. Instead, he described it as a vast agricultural world, covered in enormous farms that supplied food to multiple inhabited planets. The Venusians, he claimed, were master agriculturalists who had transformed their entire planet into a garden. He described these vast orchards that produced these fruits that had no real Earth equivalent, and he said there was grain fields that stretched beyond the horizon. And the Venusians themselves were depicted as a peaceful, industrious people who found deep satisfaction in nurturing life on a planetary scale. And his journey to Saturn was even more extraordinary. Derenberger claimed that the planet's rings were actually inhabited, with communities living in massive structures that orbited within the ring system itself. These inhabitants, he said, were master engineers who maintained the delicate balance of Saturn's ring structure and used the constant motion of the orbital environment to generate just enormous amounts of energy. But here is the scientific problem that's troubled researchers for decades. By the time Derenberger was making these claims, we already knew that Venus was a superheated world with this crushing atmospheric pressure, and that Saturn's rings were composed of ice and rock. So how could Cold, supposedly from an advanced civilization, provide such inaccurate information? And this discrepancy has led to several different theories. Perhaps Cold was lying for unknown reasons. Perhaps these were different planets that happened to share the same names. The Lanulans were from Earth originally, so it's potential that they could name things similarly to how humans now would come up with names. Maybe the encounters were taking place in some kind of alternate dimension where physics worked differently. Or perhaps, and this is what many skeptics believe, these encounters were entirely psychological and Derenberger's mind was filling in details based on outdated science fiction rather than genuine otherworldly knowledge. But now circling back to Woody's life, while he was allegedly touring the galaxy, his life on Earth was falling apart. The cost of going public with the story was enormous and ongoing, but it was the continuing claims of regular contact that truly devastated his family and social standing. And we touched on this earlier, but every time Woody claimed another encounter, another journey, another revelation from Cold, the media attention would resurge. Reporters would camp out at the home again, the phone would start ringing constantly again, and the family would face a fresh wave of ridicule and curiosity. But through all of this, Woody never recanted his story. Even decades later, even after losing everything that most people would consider important, he maintained that he sincerely believed these things happened to him. He mostly kept a low profile through the 80s, but he did continue corresponding with small groups of believers, and he even forwarded what he claimed were some letters from Cold himself. And that, everyone, is part one of the Woody Derenberger and Indrid Cold story. The initial contact and his experiences with Cold. In part two, we're going to dive into the legend, the transformation, the social impact, and other theories of what this might have been. This is a big story and something that I felt couldn't be dealt justice in just a single episode. So make sure you stay tuned for part two coming up next week, where we discuss the aftermath and what happened after Woody's initial contact and these visits and all those things that he claimed that he went on. Thank you guys so much for listening to part one. I'm super excited to get back with you for part two. The story takes such another weird turn and changes, and it's something that you're definitely going to want to hear and listen to. So please come back next week for part two. And if you like the episode, like I always say, head on over to the app you're using, find the rating section, and give us a rating. 5 stars would be amazing. Leave a comment, leave a review. All these things would be amazing to helping grow the show and reaching new audiences. And I appreciate everyone who's here listening every single week. I still haven't made those fake $100 bills to put around everywhere, but it's still something I'm thinking about doing. And you guys know the social medias, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, at Paranormal Directive 13. Please give a follow there. Help build the community in a different way other than just the podcast itself. And check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Paranormal Directive 13. We got the weekly minisodes on there. Every week there's another new minisode. Sometimes it's a creepypasta. Sometimes it's a story that just doesn't have a ton of substance, but it's still fun to tell. So check those out. Every Thursday a new minisode comes out. And send an email, paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. Any stories, any comments, anything you guys want to talk about, shoot me over an email. And remember, if you're driving home one night after selling sewing machines and you get stopped on the side of the road by a strange man, he might be worth listening to. You never know.